I just put together a short video on how to use glossaries and acronym, how to include them in a LaTeX document, because I think it's extremely useful things and you should learn if you decide to write a paper in LaTeX or to write a thesis. So for simplicity, I'm just using Overleaf because it's very simple to compile the document, to install packages. You don't have to, you can use any other LaTeX compiler on your computer. But let's start with the focus of this video, which is actually on how to add a glossary and how to use acronym in an abbreviation in your paper. So when we write paper, we have to define some terms. Sometimes we might need to explain what a term means. Okay. So for instance, this is just a very simple example of a paper that I could be writing on thermal comfort research, in which I'm defining this term, which is mixed mode buildings. Mixed mode buildings in thermal comfort research is defined as a type of building which operates in a certain specific mode, but this might not be clear to all the scientific community. So we might want to add a glossary at the end in which we explain what mixed mode buildings actually are. And this in LaTeX is super simple. So first of all, we need to use this package called Glossaries, very simple, straightforward, and we have to define a glossary entry. For each glossary entry, we have to define an abbreviation that we will use in the text. So my suggestion, keep it short, and I often use the first letter of each word, if it's possible. For instance, in this case, mixed mode buildings is MMB, okay? We need to define a name, which we will see in the glossary. So this will not appear, MMB will not appear in the glossary, but actually the name will appear, mixed mode building, and will appear in the text. Then we have to define a description. Don't really look at this description, might be wrong, but it's just an example. So we have to define a description. So what mixed mode building are and what this description will actually come up in the glossary at the end of the document. And we actually can define even a plural if we want, okay? Sometimes LaTeX will add a S to every word. So in this case, it might not be needed, but for some other words, which the plural is not just by adding an S to the end of the word, we might need to define a plural. Okay, and see how this thing helps. Well, instead of writing mixed mode buildings every time into the text here, we actually have to replace that with mixed mode building. So we replace this text here with GLS, which means glossary entry, curly bracket, and in within the curly bracket we put the abbreviation that we actually define at the top. So the key that we define at the top, which was MMB. Okay, so recompile the document and we see the change. So in the PDF we should not see any change. Okay, so let me remove the glossary for a second at the end. So in the document here we don't see any change. So mixed mode building as it was before. Actually there is a difference because before was plural. We'll fix that. And we have to fix this one as well. So GLS MMB, so we replace this one here. Okay, so let's look at the issues. So we have defined first issue that we can see is that these words should be plural. Well, that's an easy fix. We just type, instead of GLS, if you want to make it plural, we type GLS PL. PL stands for plural. We recompile the document and this becomes plural. And this is the definition of the plural, how we define it up here at the top. Okay, so if you wanted to call it mixed mode facilities, I just want to show that is going to change to that term. Okay, so mixed mode facilities. Okay, that's not correct. I know that that's not correct, but I just want to say that we can define our own plural, and we are free to do that. So let's go back to buildings. And here we have another error. So this word is at the beginning of a sentence, so should be capitalized and should be plural. So we know already how to make it plural by just adding PL at the end. And to make it capitalized is super simple, just GLS, G is capitalized. So now we have mixed mode buildings. So we learn how to make it plural and how to have GLS. Okay? So the LaTeX does not only allow, so now let's see how to add the glossary at the end. So we can see the entry here. So now we have our glossary entry, mixed mode building, operator, blah, blah, blah. This doesn't really matter, and it tells us the page. So this is the page where this, the entry comes. So for example, I can have a clear page here. So clear page just will put the glossary into the new page, and we can see that now still 1 because of course the mixed mode building up here in page number 1, and we have the glossary in the second page. So let's remove this one because it's not needed. So it's simple, more compact, and we go back here. So we just have our glossary definition. Okay. So the other thing that is super handy is to define a new acronym, as well acronym into the document, because I mean when we write a scientific paper we always want to have abbreviated word, because sometimes it's long to write always the same term more than once, and we want to save words and we want to save space in the document. So for instance, one of among the most famous thermal comfort model, this is just an example about thermal comfort. So one of the most famous thermal comfort model is the predicted mean vote. Okay, so not every time we want to write about the predicted mean vote in the document we want that it comes up as predicted mean vote, nor we want to type all this thing into the document. So we can actually define what we want to show. So we can define again an ID, a key, which we will call in the document later on. So let's keep it short. So in this case, PMV, predicted mean vote, and I like to keep it lowercase, so it's easier to type later on. This is how this will appear in the text when there is the actual abbreviation, and this is the definition of the abbreviation that will only appear the first time this term comes up into our document. But let's go with a simple example. Okay, so let's uncomment this line, the GLS. So we have already understood what this GLS means, so we call this glossary entry with this acronym. So this GLS PMV, so the PMV model, so predicted mean vote model, was developed by blah blah blah. So we compile this, and we actually see that it's super handy. So the first time we just didn't have to write all of this. You know, the software knows that the first time we need to define what PMV means. Okay, so we spell it out, predicted mean vote. And for us, we put it in within a bracket, which we didn't have to even specify, and then show us how it will appear later on in the text. Okay, it appears which is italicized just because we put it in within math symbols. Okay, if you remove the math symbols, you will see that it's just normal text. And this is extremely handy because every time the term PMV will appear in the text and we want to write about PMV, we just have to type GLS PMV, and LaTeX will do it for us. So the first time it appears, again, it spells out what this means, PMV means, and then every time it appears in the text, we just have the abbreviation. So this is extremely handy because if we decide to change the order of these lines, of course this text might not make sense any longer, but doesn't matter, it's just an example. I want to show that the definition of the PMV will actually appear now in this sentence because it's the first time where the PMV is actually mentioned. So this is going to save us a ton of time in thesis, the journal papers, because we just have to type GLS PMV and then we are sorted. And we don't even have to think about, well, we define the variable at the beginning of the paper. LaTeX sorted for us. Another very cool and useful feature is to write variables. So to write abbreviation of variables that, for instance, we are measuring. So in this case, I'm talking about the air temperature. So I'm talking about the air temperature. First of all, let's make it, because it's at the beginning of a sentence, let's make it plural. So we have air temperature because, again, it's at the beginning of a sentence. Then we have air temperature, which is TA. And this is super handy because every time we have to type TA, we will have to type T, and then we will have to write the predix, like which is the A. Okay, so in LaTeX you can do that. I mean, it's very simple, but you have to type the $, T underscore dash, and then A to have subscript. But instead of doing that every time, which is long and tedious, we can actually specify that TA is our key. This is how we want to write it in the text, and this is what is the definition of TA. That's it. So we can cancel this one. So this was just to show that the result here, can you see, is the same. But let's recompile this document. Okay, and that's it. Air temperature, TA, is defined as input, and then if we want to write TA again, this is how it appears. If we decide that we don't want it lowercase, we want it uppercase, super simple, we just type TA at the top here in the glossary section, and then everything is going to, all the changes are going to be reflected in our document. The last few things that I would like to show for this video is, well, right now we can only see the glossary. So if we also want to print all the acronym, which we have defined in the text, we just have to type in glossary and then specify the type. So in this type, in case we want to see the acronym, so the acronym should appear here, they appear here at the bottom of the text. And if you want, you can also add a table of content, and in the table of content you can decide whether or not having the acronym and the glossary specified in the table of content. In this case you can't see the acronym, so the page where the acronym and the glossary are, but if you go here in the use package, when we define a glossary and we add TOC, which stands for table of content, and we recompile the file, we'll see that actually the acronyms and the glossary will appear also in the table of content. So let's move those just for an example with a clear page. So we add a clear page after the introduction section. So we're going to move the acronyms and the glossary to page 2, and these changes are reflected in fact in the table of content. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the video.